This episode is brought to you by Forney Industries, official sponsor of Faction 46 and Nice Motorsports Truck Series teams. Forney offers versatile welding and plasma cutting machines, along with a full line of metalworking accessories for beginners, do-it-yourselfers, and professionals. Forney has everything you need for your next metalworking project. Shop for these top-of-the-line products at forneyInd.com. That's FORNEYIND.com, or at an authorized Forney dealer near you. Hey y'all, Eric Estep here. I want to welcome you all to the audiobook edition of The Legend of Groovy Hollow. The annual Groovy Hollow iRacing event is all about supporting Extra Life, a Children's Miracle Network Hospitals program. So to thank you all for your generous support over the years, we bring you The Legend of Groovy Hollow, a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. It's time for the third race at Groovy Hollow, and Tommie is dead set on competing this time around. But it seems that not only are her parents against her dreams of racing, but something else, something darker, also seems to want Tommie to change her mind. Will she manage to race again? Let's find out.
Chapter 20. Tommie sat down at the dining table for breakfast. Dad was across from her, scrolling on his phone and presumably looking at the news, which seemed more sensational with each passing day. Mom was in the kitchen. Tommie could hear her humming from the doorway. She always hummed when she cooked, and that was how Tommie was able to gauge her mood. She seemed to be in a good mood that particular morning. Tommie, meanwhile, had never felt more devastated. It was strange, in a way, to be so affected by the loss of Jerry Slater. She didn't really know him. In fact, not even a single word had been exchanged between them. The loss of anyone is a sad affair, but normally, unless the person was prominent in her life, she was able to get over it rather quickly, or at the very least, steering her mind toward a different direction or alternative train of thought was much easier. But Jerry's death loomed over her like a darkened storm cloud. It threatened to rain, but never poured. If it started to rain on her mind and Tommie could cry it all out, she believed she might feel better. But alas, her eyes were dry, carrying immense sadness, but unable to show it in any meaningful way. She looked over at her dad. He stared intently down at his phone, swiping left and right, scrolling. She wondered what he was thinking, and whether or not Jerry's death was as much of a load on him as it was on her. It was probably worse in all actuality. Though he and Jerry were never really friends, they knew of one another and sometimes talked. Tommie got the sense that Dad pitied Jerry in a way, like he was a foolish younger brother making a ton of mistakes that backed him into binds he could never escape. But still, there was a good person there, however, deep inside, and that was the real tragedy of the matter. For all of Jerry's flaws, and they were plentiful, he was still a good person in the end, whether he believed it in himself or not. Tommie's late model, sitting covered up in the garage and untouched for months, came from Jerry. In a way, it was a piece of Jerry that was now in the possession of Tommie and her dad, and she didn't quite understand what to do about that fact. "Is Mom making breakfast?" Tommie asked her father to break the silent spell that had befallen them. Dad looked up and hummed, "Mom, I take it she's making breakfast?" Dad blinked distractedly. Yeah, that's what she's doing. Should be out really soon." He was quiet then and returned his attention to his phone. "What are you doing?" Tommie asked. "Looking at obits online?" Dad confessed morbidly. "It's too early for Jerry's to show up on here, I think. I wonder who'll write it. His mom, maybe? Or she might get someone at the paper to do it. I don't know." "Are you looking for the arrangements?" Dad nodded, and Tommie noticed his eyes starting to well up. He didn't cry, though, and Tommie was relieved. She had never seen her father cry. Mom came into the dining room and carried a pot. Her humming had ceased. "Here we go," she said as she put the pot down into the holder. Tommie looked inside. Creamy oatmeal. "I've got toast in the oven. It should be done any minute now, and I'll bring in the brown sugar and cinnamon." She spun around then and headed back for the kitchen. Her humming had ceased. Tommie reached forward and grabbed the wooden spoon from the pot. She plopped down a generous helping of steaming oatmeal in her bowl and waited for Mom to return with the sugar and cinnamon. Dad did the same, not once looking up from his phone at Tommie. Whatever obits he was reading on that screen captured his full attention. "Dad, are you okay?" Dad blinked and looked up as if coming out of a dream. He shook his head as if ridding himself of any and all remnants of the dream. "What? Yeah, I'm fine. The real question here is, are you all right, kiddo?" Tommie's eyes darted away from his. She was determined not to cry in front of him. "I don't know, honestly. I didn't even know Jerry, but it's hitting you hard, I know. I understand. It's affecting me pretty badly, too." Tommie shook her head. "No, I mean, I get why it would upset you. You knew him, talked to him. Heck, Dad, you made a business deal with him," she said, motioning towards the car out in the garage. "That doesn't mean that I knew him that well. I knew of him, like we've seen and walked by each other in the halls at school or the grocery store when we were older. I've seen him race, but we haven't even had any conversations about that. But when someone dies, Tommie, it's hard on everybody." Dad looked like he wanted to continue the conversation, but stopped when Mom walked back into the room. He smiled and looked up at her. The two shared a brief kiss before Mom placed the brown sugar and cinnamon shaker down on the table. She sat down between Tommie and her father and helped herself to some oatmeal. For a while, all that could be heard was the sounds of silverware striking glass bowls and uncomfortable shifting. Mom cleared her throat and gave Dad a certain look. She then nodded towards Tommie. Clearly, she had something on her mind. Dad cleared his throat then. He looked away almost as if he were ashamed to have the impending conversation. Perhaps he was. Maybe he knew just about how well it was going to go. "So, listen, Tommie," Dad said after taking a short, refreshing sip of his Mountain Dew. "Your mother and I talked last night about what happened, and we think—" Before he could finish the sentence himself, Mom cut him off. "We think you ought to spend a little less time at Ivy Park." Tommie wasn't surprised. Mom had never been shy about her feelings towards racing and Tommie's future in it. If she thought that Carol and Jerry were bad influences on her, why wouldn't she say something to deter her from spending her afternoons there? Tommie didn't get angry or cross. She knew that lashing out would have the opposite effect on her desired outcome. Instead, she sat there in her silence, stirring her oatmeal. Suddenly, she didn't have much of an appetite. Mom and Dad tried to gauge her reaction, but ultimately failed. Dad waited out the silence as long as he could. Then he said, "We just don't think it's the healthiest place for you to spend your time right now, you know? Do you understand?" "Of course she understands," Mom exclaimed. "She's a smart girl." Mom turned to her and smiled. "Tommie, well, I'm thrilled you volunteered so many hours there, and no doubt that time was valuable to you and your future. I'm not questioning that. I just think that maybe it's time to move on and volunteer in another area of life. Like maybe at the animal shelter or something. You love animals. I think it'd be a great fit." Finally, Tommie spoke. "What I really love is talking to Carol about racing." "I know you do, honey. That's not the issue. And I'm sure Carol is a wonderful person. But at the same time, you have to remember your priorities and keep them in check. You have the ACT coming up. Now you've gotten your volunteer hours in. That's great. Now it's time to focus on other aspects of college litmus tests. I bought you that book and study guide from Amazon. Have you even opened it?" "Yes, I have," Tommie said, which wasn't technically a lie. She did crack it open and got about halfway through the first chapter before deciding that she was bored out of her mind. After that, she turned her attention to Frankenstein by Mary Shelley instead. "Good, but you need to study hard for this test. There's a lot riding on it, honey." Dad remained silent. Tommie was calm. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she lash out, spouting cross things just to hurt her mother. Again, there was nothing to gain in that sort of behavior. Rather, she stood up and gently pushed her bowl of oatmeal to the side. "You said I ought to keep my priorities in check, right, Mom?" Her mother nodded. "Well, I am. My #1 priority is getting back in the race car as soon as possible." "Tommie, you're not going to make Groovy Hollow this year," Mom said. "You don't think I know that? It was supposed to be my first time this October, you know? My first time ever racing at our home track. And I admit I suffered a setback, but that's all it is, a setback. I'm going to watch the race over at Ivy Park with Carol, and it's going to kill me inside knowing that I should be out there, but I'll get through it. I'll get better soon, and I'll be in that race next year. Just you watch, no matter whether you think I can do it or not. We're not attacking your abilities, Tommie. Dad stepped in. And if that's what really you want to do, we'll support it. Mom flashed him a revealing glare. But there's more to life than racing. The situation Carol's in now and Jerry was in should be enough to make you realize that. But his words were just noise. Tommie turned and left the dining room. She walked across the living room, grabbed her coat and purse, and left the house, heading straight for Ivy Hall. Chapter 21. They're just worried about you, Carol reassured Tommie. I know that, Tommie admitted, but that doesn't make it any less irritating. She paused a moment before asking the question that was burning deep inside her. How did you deal with it? Deal with what? Carol's mouth was full of whatever mush the hospital cafeteria was serving up that day. It was gray and looked like some kind of protein surprise. You know, your family, your friends, were they worried that you wanted to be, were a racer? Carol shrugged. I'm sure they did, she said, swallowing down the sludge with a grimace. And I'm sure they spoke about it, just like your family did with you. You don't remember? No, Tommie, those moments are so insignificant in my life because they didn't serve a purpose for my ultimate goals. Neither did I ever consider them enough to really have much of an impact on my situation. So no, I don't remember their protests. Or maybe a better way to put it is that I ignored them. She paused then, taking the opportunity to get a sip of water from her styrofoam cup. She smacked her lips. But I also had the slight advantage of taking after my daddy. He was a racer, Tommie. Worked as a mechanic by day and drove cars at night around the local bullrings. Was he any good? Tommie asked. He was the best. He was a wizard when it came to driving cars. Mama never took to it much. She didn't really like that he did it, even at a semi-professional level. But any hopes of him giving up evaporated over time. By the time I came along and started to show interest in racing, Mama had been case-hardened. Sometimes I guess I just feel like they don't understand me. I mean, I'm talking to them in plain English, but it's like I'm speaking Chinese or something. It's because they don't understand you, Tommie. They just don't. They might say they do, but it's all malarkey. Your dad, you said that he works on the car with you. Tommie nodded. Well, he might be able to understand you more than your mama, but not fully. Never fully. There's a difference between restoring an old stock car and actually driving one around the track. At competition, no less. And for someone like your mama who never did it, never wanted to do it, and never showed any interest in it as a fan, it is like you're speaking Chinese at her. It just doesn't register, and that's okay, as long as you understand the reality and get that it isn't anything malicious. Tommie was silent for a moment. She looked down and twiddled her thumbs before Carol said, I've had enough of this crap. Can you dump it, please? The old woman shoved the tray away from her somewhat dramatically. Tommie stood up and walked over to her. She wiped the elderly driver's mouth, then removed the tray. When she came back, she asked the woman, So, how do you drive it? Groovy Hollow, how do you drive it? I plan to race there next year, and I just wanted to know whether or not you have any tips for me. Very carefully is how you drive that track. The straightaway is very wide. It funnels down into a single groove on the inside. You never want to get out of that groove. It's too slick. You'll crash. The only real way to pass is to either knock the driver in front of you out of the groove so that they must check up significantly, or try to fan out to the inside on one of the straightaways and try to beat him down into the corner from there. It's a real old-school style of racing, like NASCAR used to do back in the day. Think old Bristol during the days of Earnhardt and Labonte, a far cry from the multi-groove style of racing that they have and promote today. What about working the throttle? Is there a key to that? Carol Oates chuckled. Yeah, there's always a key to that. It's part of the art of driving. I'd let off heading into each corner. You'll want to tap the brakes, resist the urge. You'll feel uncomfortable at first, like you're at risk of flying straight out of the track. But the cars have enough downforce to be where you'll be all right. Somewhere just past the center of turns 1 and 2, there's a bump. Be wary of that. That's also around the point where you'll want to gas it back up, but it varies from car to car. Depends on how the thing's handling, you know. Turns 3 and 4 are a little bit different. My advice in regard to that corner is to get out there and practice. Keep your eye on the wall. Feel the car, and where it feels most natural, gas it back up in the corner. Try to find some sort of visual key, like an advertisement on the wall or something. A hot dog stand, anything, just practice and search for it. That's really all you can do. She paused then and looked up as if deep in thought. You want to know the darndest thing, Tommy? What's that? Tommy asked with good humor. I know when the track reappeared, it was run down, or so it seemed. But when I watched that first race back, it looked as it once did. Worn, but not in desperate need of a repave. It looked like a driver's kind of track, a handling track, which is part of the reason I was enticed to return to behind the wheel. When I got out there a year later, though, the asphalt was darker. I drove more smoothly than anticipated. Tommy shrugged and asked, could it have been just a visual difference? I know that there were murmurs of a repave when we cleaned it up. Whether or not they did it, I don't know. And things do look different on TV or online than they do in real life. I don't know. Could be, Carol said. And they left it there. Chapter 22. The third annual Groovy Hollow 300 took place on the night of Tuesday, October 24th. Though her leg was feeling miles better and she was on the clear road to recovery, Tommie Jo Swanson was sitting out, sadly, at the age of 18 years old. She made arrangements to watch the race with Carol in her room, receiving special permission from the head of the hospital to remain in the facility after hours, so long as she agreed to check out at the front desk and immediately leave at the conclusion of the night's event. She didn't get there early enough to watch qualifying and practice. School had taken a toll on her, and she went into the garage to tinker with Amelia alongside her father before losing track of time and heading to the retirement home in a frazzled and dirty hurry. I thought maybe we'd watch the race together, Dad said, somewhat disappointed. His feelings were bruised, that was for sure, and Tommy's heart ached over it. We will next year, just like old times. She paused then and considered Amelia. She tapped at her name, which was written in the lost art of cursive over the driver's side door. Well, maybe not exactly like old times, she said, beaming with pride. Dad matched her expression. Okay, then I'll be getting a VIP pass, won't I? Of course, you and Mama both. She kissed him on the cheek. But I gotta go now, Dad. I'll be back, and it won't be too late. It better not be, he said. It's a school night. Tommy waved her goodbyes and left. She wasn't dressed in her candy striper uniform. She didn't go to Ivy Park in that capacity. She palled around with Rachel at the front desk before heading down the long, sometimes depressing hallway. She tiptoed past the room that used to house Jerry Slater. She peered inside. The room was empty, as a new occupant hadn't moved in yet. But Tommy, getting a pretty good sense of how things were around there, guessed it wouldn't be long until one did. At the moment, though, the room was quiet and still. There was a darkness to it, but it didn't seem eternal. The white moon shone brightly through the window and curtains were brushed aside. The bed was empty, and she knew it would be neatly made with the sheets pulled tight so no creases or wrinkles would appear. A troubling thought came to her then. Could the rooms in a nursing home be haunted? What about the whole facility? If any place was going to be haunted, shouldn't it be a place such as this? Then she fell down the terrible rabbit hole of thinking about just how many previous residents passed in that very room. How many passed in Carol's room? Probably too many to count. But Carol wouldn't. Tommy was certain of that. She put all those awful thoughts aside and walked 3 doors down. She knocked at the open door. It was a pleasantry of a gesture above all else. Carol sipped her chocolate milk and glanced at the door. She wasn't alarmed. She suspected her. "Tommie, come in and get us all hooked up. The race is about to begin." Tommie did just that and glanced at the clock over the door. It read 7:30, but Tommie knew that it was set 5 minutes fast. All the clocks in Ivy Park were. She questioned this on occasion but was never given a reason for it. It probably didn't matter anyhow. In no time, Tommie had her laptop open and logged onto YouTube for the live stream. There was an animated countdown as it reached number 1. Tommie felt a small prick of regret. Oh, how she wished she was there. She probably should have been there. And she knew this feeling of remorse and missed opportunity would only intensify once the screen came on and she could fully see the track. But if she couldn't be there and she wasn't watching it on the couch with her father, sitting there with a seasoned racer like Carol was the next best thing. The out-of-the-groove music sounded over her crappy computer speakers. Man, it sounded so much better on TV. Even Eric's voice, when she would watch his videos on the flat-screen smart TV in her living room, sounded so much more cinematic. It was depressing how big the gap was between the quality of sound on a computer and that of a television. But she shook the thought away. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome you back to our annual Groovy Hollow 300 event, hosted by the mysterious and gorgeous Groovy Hollow Raceway, Eric Estep said. He was in the booth this year, rather than on the track to give the command to start engines. This was a good change, Tommie guessed, though she had never seen the stream coverage before and couldn't comment on the performance of the previous years. She always thought he'd be a good color commentator, or maybe even a play-by-play analyst. Danny Jackson and Hochsteiner from YouTube joined him in the booth. There was a fourth man in the booth, someone Tommie had never seen before. He was tall and skinny with sun-kissed skin and a shaved head. A bar at the bottom of the screen read his name and who he worked for. Greg Maloney, Groovy Media. With us here today is Greg from Groovy Media. How you doing, Greg? I'm doing great, guys, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all at the infamous Groovy Hollow Raceway for tonight's race. All the proceeds go to charity, and it should be a fun time. Eric said, "This has been a passion project to you for a long time now. Tell us a little bit about how you became involved in this project and what you're hoping will come of it." Well, like I said, Eric, all the proceeds for this race from sponsorships and donations, not to mention ticket sales, all go to various charities that we're involved in. So that's pretty neat, and the most important thing about this event. And I'm very proud of our outreach and everything we've gotten to do with it. With a single race, we were able to give back to the Commonwealth community like nobody ever has before. And it's just been a real treat. Not to mention the on-track product, which has been a real treat for us the last couple of years. We've got a lot of young and talented racers putting on some of the best on-track product of any short-track series across the country. It certainly has been a great race the last couple of years. And then, of course, there's the return of Bucky Blackwell to his old stomping grounds. Danny chimed in. There was a pause then in the broadcast that seemed almost unnatural. Tommie and Carol looked at each other and then turned their attention back to the screen. Greg took in a deep breath and sighed. Ah, yes, Bucky Blackwell. He certainly is a master of this track. For the last 2 years, he dominated this event. The last year, the Junkyard Jacks sure gave him a run for his money. The Junkyard Jacks, Eric started. Sure was a rough and tumble group, weren't they? Will they be returning this year? Yeah, the Junkyard Jacks sure were an interesting group. But no, they weren't here to qualify, and a spot was not saved for them. That's not to say that we didn't reach out. We did. We just never heard anything back. But if they're up for it, we'd love for them to turn back out for next year's event. They sure put on a hell of a show for Groovy Hollow, too. Danny said, "Well, we know that the Junkyard Jacks aren't returning, but what about defending race winner Bucky Blackwell?" "Yes," Greg said with a big grin on his face. "Yes, Blackwell is back with his infamous Halloween machine. Last year, there was some controversy about it, and I understand. Let me explain. Last year, the promoters and I created a rule that states so long as we have this Groovy Hollow event, and it is annual, the past winner or the champion of the race gets an automatic invite and a reserve spot in the field. We didn't make that rule change transparent last year, and it sparked some controversy amongst our fans, claiming that we were showing favoritism to Blackwell, which just wasn't and isn't the case. Last year, Blackwell opted not to qualify in order to save some of his equipment. Therefore, you at home and the spectators here did not see him turn a single lap in practice or qualifying. But he will be in the event, starting all the way back in the 40th spot. Last year, he raced to the front and won. Can he do the same this year? That suspense and all this excitement is what this support and event truly is all about. Thanks for clearing that up for us, Craig, Eric said, turning back to face the camera. It'll be a real pleasure to be able to watch this race from this angle and see how the storytelling of Bucky Blackwell and the Groovy Hollow Raceway unfolds as the laps tick down here today. That's right, Eric, Danny said. We can't wait for the engines to fire, so let's go trackside for the opening ceremonies. The mics in the booth cut out and the camera panned away, showing a color guard displaying the American flag. The track fell silent. The overhead announcer's voice boomed through the stadium saying, "Will everyone please rise as you are able and remove your hats as the Commonwealth High School ROT presents our nation's colors." There was a thick silence then, which lasted for about a minute. Then the at-track announcer cut through the haze and said, "Before we get to the singing of our national anthem, we here at Groovy Hollow Raceway would like to take a moment of silence to honor one of our fallen brethren, a fellow local racer who participated in this race last year, Jerry Slater." The Slater name echoed through the surrounding mountains. Tommie squirmed uncomfortably and glanced over at Carol. Her face was stony, her lips pressed firmly together. The moment of silence felt as if it lasted in reality several moments, like it was never ending. In Tommie's mind, the world stopped turning. She glanced over at the closet in Carol's room. He was left open just a crack, and Tommie began to wonder if it was like that when she walked into the room. It had to be, right? There was no way that it just popped open on its own. Her gaze remained fixated with that thin sliver of an opening. The rich darkness inside seemed darker than even the shadow-laden hallway outside. As she stared at it, her mind started to play tricks on her. She saw things move that shouldn't have been, couldn't have been, squirming in the darkness. But perhaps the most terrible thing she saw in a snippet of silence was a black, corrupted eye sunken amidst a white, moonlit face watching her, peeping out. "Thank you," the track announcer said, and the face and its writhing companions vanished. Nothing was left. Nothing was ever there in the first place. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, to be scared of. And now, to perform our national anthem, please welcome the Commonwealth High School Marching Bandit Band. The snare drummer started his role, and the drum major started to conduct. The band was huge, dressed in their usual burgundy, white, and gold getup. The plumes in their shakos, black with sparkling flecks of gold, reached upward as if to touch the sky. As the bombs went bursting in the air and the flag was still there, Tommie glanced back to the closet in the corner of the room. Nothing was there. She felt increasingly silly by the second, but still on edge all the same. She considered getting up and closing the darn closet for a second, but she was afraid Carol would dog on her in her paranoia. It was unlikely, she knew, and out of the old woman's character, but still a legitimate concern. So instead, she sat there to the left of Carol's bed, keeping an eye on the thin gap of corroded darkness. On the screen, the camera panned to the sky as fireworks exploded over the night. The crowd roared excitedly. Tommie noted then just how much, with each passing year, this Groovy Hollow event, which started as a short-track, cultish kind of race, was growing into a real full-fledged production that could rival NASCAR. She and Carol watched the fireworks burst and rain their burnt orange sparks down on the slumbering mountains off in the distance. Then little time was wasted. Drivers were already climbing into their cars. The camera didn't pan over to the number 31 Halloween machine until Bucky Blackwell was already in the car and masked behind his black-tinted windshield. "And now," said the at-track announcer, "for the most famous words in motorsports, please welcome—" The crowd roared on, a preamble to the rumbling of the engines they were just moments away from. The announcer approached the start-finish line with the microphone in hand. He paused a moment, taking in the ambiance of the moment. Tommie could only imagine how electrifying it truly was. "How y'all doing tonight?" The crowd's cheers grew louder and restless. "Are you ready for some racing?" The crowd's reaction made it clear that they were. "Well then, with no further ado, drivers, start your engines!" He belched into the microphone. The symphony of starting engines commenced. The camera panned out, and the starting lineup appeared on the bottom of the screen. Claiming the pole, looking for his third attempt to dethrone Bucky Blackwell, was Brandon Power in the number 44 Chevy. Starting alongside him was David Smith, driving his usual number 25, but this year sporting the black, pink, and white colors of his favorite NASCAR website. As the ticker went through the field, Tommie wished harder that she was there, smelling the smells and hearing all the glorious sounds a race weekend naturally produces. On more than a couple of occasions throughout the night, she reached beside her for a program that wasn't there. Predictably, the last driver shown on the ticker, starting all the way back in the 40th position, was Bucky Blackwell. The graphic appeared with his name and hometown. He was from Whisperwood, just a 30-minute drive from the track. But where his likeness should have been was nothing but a ghostly black silhouette. Still no picture, Tommie noted. He won the thing 2 years and counting, and there's still no picture. It was an oddity, for sure. Then, as if the announcers on the screen were reading her mind, Eric said, "And you may notice that there's no picture of Bucky Blackwell on our starting grid. That's not because none exist," he explained. "But he's a hard man to catch on camera, and the rare instances when someone does, it's always corrupted in some way. It's either fuzzy and so dark you can barely make him out." It was a sensible enough explanation, Tommie supposed, but she still didn't like it. It was dreadfully eerie. "Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense," Carol argued, but then paused, pondering something. She sighed. "But I'm not surprised. He's a shifty character, that Blackwell. Maybe he doesn't want his picture taken because of his extracurricular activities. Or maybe there's another explanation, a supernatural one." Tommie side-eyed Carol for an indication that the old driver was joking. There was none. Her face remained stony and grim, as serious as a heart attack you can't come back from. She thought about asking Carol what she meant by it, but decided not to. In truth, she wasn't sure she wanted to know. But if she fully intended to race against Blackwell the following year, maybe it was something she needed to know and take into account. But she would burn that bridge when she got there. She glanced over at the opening of the closet door. In the rich darkness, she saw things moving, squirming. And while all that was unsettling enough, she was still glad that no moonlit face was there, staring back at her with its awful sunken eyes. "Starting last," Carol said ponderously. "He won't stay there long," Tommie noted, and Carol nodded in agreement. Brandon Power led the field from the pit road onto the worn surface of the track. Tommie paid special attention to that after Carol brought it to her attention. She was right, the track did look a lot rougher than last year, though Tommie considered that they might have been a trick of the camera. Everyone looks different on camera than it does in real life. She chalked it up to a deception of the lens. Still, the racing surface looked as if it were just barely being held together by toothpicks and tape. If the drivers had any trepidation over the condition of the track, they didn't show it. They drove up on the slight banking in turns 1 and 2, weaving backwards and forwards, cleaning as well as rubbing some heat into their tires. The fields ran some pace laps. They ran down pit road to gauge what should be a pit road speed and checked for any and all issues they may have, then lined up for the start. The lap before the official green flag seemed uncharacteristically long for a track so short in size. But the moment they'd all been waiting for came in all due time. As Power entered the start-restart box, he gunned it up and led the field to the green flag. The race was underway.
Thanks for listening, Groovy Gang. We'll be back with more Legend of Groovy Hollow in a moment.
Hey there, NASCAR fans. Have you got your copy of the latest edition of NASCAR Pole Position Print Magazine? If not, there's no better time than now to subscribe at polepositionmag.com. NASCAR Pole Position is the only print magazine covering NASCAR. Officially licensed by NASCAR, NASCAR Pole Position magazine is published throughout the NASCAR season, and each edition is an instant collector's item, packed with great feature stories and photography. The magazine is even mailed to you in a poly bag for those who love to collect NASCAR memorabilia. At polepositionmag.com, you can even find past issues available to purchase. Get your subscription to NASCAR Pole Position and get great NASCAR content delivered straight to your mailbox throughout the season. Learn more at polepositionmag.com. That's polepositionmag.com.
All right, gang, we're back. Let's return now to the legend of Groovy Hollow.
Chapter 23. The race in the early stages was a good one. As both Carol and Tommie predicted, Bucky Blackwell, even without the pick that was Jerry Slater, made his way to the front in a hurry. David Smith wrestled the lead away from Brandon Power after the first 10 laps. But by lap 30, Blackwell was in the lead and pulling away to great lengths. In her mind, Tommie told herself that if she could only be out there, things would be different. It'd be a different outcome. She glanced back at the closet. The face was back. Inside, the dead face of Jerry Slater was staring back at her. His awfully twisted features gnarled into a scream of deep agony. She stifled a scream and looked at Carol, who seemed oblivious to the apparition. Until a figure disappeared moments later, Tommie wrestled with whether or not to draw Carol's attention to the ghost. On one hand, she didn't want to frighten the old woman. A scare of that magnitude wouldn't be in her best interest health-wise for obvious reasons. But she also asked herself if Carol would be frightened by the sight of Jerry's ghost at all. It was possible that rather than being scared out of her wits, she'd feel vilified in her concerns that something with Groovy Hollow Raceway and Bucky Blackwell wasn't on the up and up. Supernatural, Tommie thought to herself and glanced back to the closet. Jerry was fading now. Pretty soon there wouldn't be much left of him. Until he came back, she reminded herself with horror and shook the unpleasant thought away. In the race, with the laps winding down, the circumstances becoming more dire as they inched towards the finish, Blackwell raced just as he had in the race's previous 2 runnings, with urgency, aggression, and little remorse. Whenever the camera panned to show the crowd, Tommie was surprised, though she probably shouldn't have been by how many fans she saw wearing Halloween machine gear. His fandom certainly seemed to be spreading like a disease, and Tommie didn't understand it. He was a relatively dirty driver, not to mention his questionable past and all the other problematic issues concerning his legend. That was when the wires in her head connected. Legend. For fans of any sport, NASCAR and racing being no exception, there's always a sort of attraction toward the bad boy. For years, despite his run-ins with Dale Jr., a significant number of fans flocked to Kyle Busch. Before him, many of those same fans loved Dale Earnhardt, even cheering him on when he committed the most egregious acts on track. And though the fan base of the most popular driver in the sport, that being Bill Elliott in Earnhardt Sr.'s time, and Earnhardt's own flesh and blood, Dale Jr. and Busch's, despised those black hat-wearing drivers with great fervor. It almost didn't seem to matter. Their hate was almost like fuel to keep the fire going, igniting something beneath both the drivers and their unpopular fan bases. In Groovy Hollow, Bucky Blackwell was a man of legend. Not much was known about him, his checkered past, nor his phantasmic present. His reputation loomed over the sport and the racing facility the way only a true superstars or supervillains could. It was almost as if he overshadowed the sport himself. Blackwell led most of the closing laps of the race, unsurprisingly, en route to his 3rd win in a row. They watched the screen with great anticipation as the number 31 Halloween machine was doing burnouts. Amidst all the gray smoke rising up from the sizzling pavement, the mythical car of Bucky Blackwell faded and disappeared. "You see, supernatural," Carol called out, pointing at the screen. Tommie stared back over at the closet. Jerry Slater's face was nowhere to be seen. "Yeah," she said with a yawn, not from boredom, but from genuine exhaustion. "I think we ought to call it a night, Carol, okay? I'll come by and visit you tomorrow." "You work tomorrow?" Carol asked. "No, but that doesn't mean I can't stop by." The nurse cleared her throat at the door. "I think that's my cue to exit. Good night, sweetie," Tommie told Carol, who slipped out and was ushered by the nurse. Chapter 24. Tommie didn't sleep well after leaving the hospital. Mom was already in bed when she walked through the front door. Dad was still up but somewhat dozing. He heard the door click shut behind her and was startled. He blinked through his onsetting sleep and smiled. "Tommie, enjoy the race?" "No," she wanted to say, "no, and it's not just because I wasn't out there. There's something wrong in Commonwealth. And Bucky Blackwell's at the center of it all." But all she could manage to do was swallow her fear hard and say, Yeah, it was a good race." Dad shook his head, ridding himself of some of that sleep. Then he cocked his eyebrows. "Even the winner? You enjoyed that?" Tommie shook her head. "Well, no, but you always told me, especially during the years Dale Jr. wasn't running particularly well, that the sign of a true race fan is enjoying the racing, regardless of who actually goes to victory lane. Isn't that right, or did you forget?" She teased her father. The teasing felt good and normal when all she wanted to do was go to her room and spend the night alone. She would get to do that in time, though. Right now, it was about putting up a confident front. "Right, yeah." He looked at her a moment through squinted eyes, then blurted out, "Something's bugging ya." Tommie looked at him with the deadest expression she could and said, "Oh?" "Yeah," Dad said, "and I think I know what it is. You're upset that you couldn't be out there, right? That was supposed to be your debut, but..." He shrugged as if the gesture finished his thought. In a way, it did. "Yeah," Tommie agreed reluctantly. "Yeah, I guess that's it." "Well, Tommie, you and I know you'll be out there soon. Next year, probably. And then you can be the one to take it to old Bucky Blackwell." He turned his attention back to the TV. The stream had ended, and he fumbled through the smart TV's various functions to put it back on the cable box. He didn't flinch when he said Blackwell's name. Rather, he stared blankly at the TV, fishing through channels. Tommie thought it was odd, but decided not to dwell on it. She said as she rubbed her eyes and put up a fake yawn, "Well, Dad, I think I'm gonna turn in. It's been a long night, you know." Dad nodded, and Tommie went upstairs to her bedroom. She shut the door behind her gently and headed straight for the bed. The long night that had already transpired was about to grow even longer. The covers pooled around her ankles as she lay there in bed. She stared up at the ceiling, waiting for the Sandman to come and work his magic. But he never made an appearance. Tommie tossed and turned through the night. A couple of times she got up, walked over to her bedroom window and stared out. The street below was dimly lit by yellow streetlights, amplified by the cosmic glow of a full moon. It was empty and quiet, as it should have been in the middle of the night on a Commonwealth street. Still, a crisp uneasiness in the air nipped at her. From that window, Tommie could see the woods and the stone path that led to the Groovy Hollow Raceway. But crooked trees masked the track itself. In her head, she could imagine the sounds of a revving engine echoing out of those woods, and she started to wonder if Bucky Blackwell was out there somewhere. She wondered, considering that the track and he seemed to be one and the same, or at the very least related, if he might be out there somewhere watching her, taunting her. The thought broke her arms out into gooseflesh and sent her mind to wander around drunkenly in the darkest corners of her imagination. Tommie shunned the window and walked back to her bed. She got in it but kept the covers off. It was too hot in the house, and she was already covered in sticky sweat. She knew that she'd never be able to sleep in such conditions, so she got up again and walked over to her TV. She turned it on and mindlessly flipped through the channels just as her dad had when she came in, hoping that it would be the medicine she needed to make her a little drowsy and too tired to think about Blackwell, the race, and what was to come in the next year. However, rather than finding anything mind-numbing enough to court the Sandman tour, she stopped on the IFC channel, which was showing a syndicated broadcast of the original 1989 Pet Sematary movie. For a moment, she thought of flipping past it, knowing darn well that if she kept it on that channel, she'd never sleep through the night. But something stopped her. Instead of flipping past the channel, she left it on, the sounds of the film providing her a strange comfort she couldn't quite explain. She returned to glance out the window. Nothing had changed except when she looked at the garage below, the building that housed her wounded number 28 Chevrolet, and saw that the door was cracked just a smidge. It was impossible to think that she or her father would ever be careless enough to let such a thing happen. So in her disbelief, she blinked 3 times and refocused her eyes. Upon looking at the garage door again, it was as it should have always been, closed and presumably locked. She returned to her bed, no longer feeling overwhelmed, and pulled the blankets over her. She watched the movie while occasionally glancing aside at her closet door, which was left slightly ajar. Had she left it that way? She didn't think so, but couldn't be sure. Whatever the case, she wasn't about to go to sleep with the closet door slightly open. Not after what she had seen in Carol's room at the nursing home. Tommie got out of bed and the music from the film started to amp up. She felt like she was in a horror flick herself. A nightmarish Days of Thunder with all the ghosts and demonic race cars one would expect. She grabbed hold of the doorknob. It was cool to the touch. 1, she counted. 2. The doubt started to creep in now. There was no way she would be foolish enough to open the closet door, was she? 3. Tommie swung the door open and quickly reached for the light just inside. She hoped nothing grabbed her, but it didn't. The light came in and bleached her room. There was nothing inside the closet except for her own silly paranoia. She sighed and uttered an airy laugh. She left the light on and returned to her bed. She watched the movie before finally and gracefully getting the couple of hours of sleep she craved. Her dreams fed off the film and whatever horror flick that no doubt played after. She enjoyed the movies in her mind for what they were, knowing that they were fake. Except for the last one. Oh, that one felt all too real. Chapter 25. In her dream, Tommie is at the racetrack. What racetrack isn't known, not off the bat. Not that it matters much. Tommie enjoys being at all sorts of tracks all over the Southeast. She just enjoys the atmosphere, the sounds and smells, the crowd with the shared interest and the swagger of the drivers. Tommie is going to be one someday, she just knows it. Someday, Tommie laments like an omniscient narrator. Someday, that's going to be me. This is how Tommie knows she is dreaming, and the dream itself is tightening around a memory. Dad is there, as she knew he would be. He's towering over her to her left, a reminder of just how tall he used to be before time and growth on her part seemed to shrink him. He is eating a hot dog slathered in neon green relish. He notices her looking and hands it over to her, offering her a bite. Tommie can feel the look her face makes. She tenses up and shoves the hot dog away. She never liked relish, and she had no intention of starting any time soon. Dad laughs, and it's a joyous sound. He reaches for yet another sip from his long-neck glass bottle of Mountain Dew. Tommie doesn't grab it from him this time. She doesn't shoot him disapproving looks, or hope that her father will take better care of himself. She lets it go, and doesn't have anything to do with her caring less. She doesn't think that's true. She just knows that it's not a hill worth dying on, not in the grand scheme of things. She turns back to the track, feeling her pigtails bob along her shoulders. She's younger, but as far as her exact age goes, she isn't sure. She just knows that she hasn't had her hair tied up into pigtails in ages. Then she notices what she's wearing. A candy-striped shirt she doesn't remember ever owning beneath a pair of denim overalls. But what astounds her the most is that while she feels younger, she still has all her wits about her. That maturity that comes with the passage of time and the general loss of innocence. The late model stocks are all lined up down on pit road. Their uncovered crews surrounding them, giving them their final touches. Suddenly, day turns to night, and the air possesses a welcome chill to eat away at the hot, sun-baked day that preceded it. Tommie takes a good long look at the cars lined up on pit road. Some of them she recognizes. Out front is a number 88 red Sundrop car. She realizes that time is split and all jumbled in her head because that specific car didn't run until the present day at North Wilkesboro 2024. And the driver who drove that race, she was blanking on his name, but that's not who is climbing into the car now. Rather, it's Dale Earnhardt Jr. himself. As if on cue, the announcer above introduces the future or current NASCAR Hall of Famer. Jr. waves to the crowd before slipping all the way into his car and getting ready to race. That isn't the only car she recognizes. There are others. The Junkyard Jacks are back in all their neon liveries. David Smith has come back, this time sporting a car carrying his own brand, Dogleg Media. There are all the other usual suspects, of course. But the car that catches her eye the most isn't any of the junkyards, the various local hopefuls, or even the Halloween machine itself, which is resting steaming at the back of the pack just as she knew it would be. Rather, the car that catches her attention the most is lined up to start in the 13th position. A solid black car with a silver, almost chrome number 28 on the door. Tommie feels a certain kind of kinship to that car and she points at it, tugging her dad's sleeve to show him. But when her hand reaches for him, there's nobody there. Her fist balls up over empty air. Tommie looks to her left. The grandstands are empty. She looks to her right. It's all the same. She looks at the press box atop the bleachers, but the harsh white stadium lights are blinding. There's nothing to be seen up there except for the vague resemblance of the Groovy Hollow Raceway logo, and a single darkened silhouette beyond the foggy glass windows. Tommie returns her attention to the track down below. She's the only one in the grandstands now, and she feels uncomfortable and exposed. The cars are still all lined up as they should have been, but the various crew members and workers down in the pits and garage area are gone, and they've vanished. Tommie has never heard a racetrack so unnervingly silent before, completely devoid of all sound and commotion. Then a single engine fired. The number 28 Chevrolet started to roll, and Tommie got a good look at the name just over the door. It popped, unlike the ghostly scheme of the car. The name read Slater. With Jerry Slater presumably behind the wheel, the number 28 car runs the length of pit road and feeds up onto the track. It runs first at a virtual walking pace before slowly speeding up once it gets over the backstretch to caution speed. After a couple of laps, Slater throws the car into gear and the engine roars to life. He approaches the first corner at full speed and turns about 10 good laps on his own virtual qualifying laps. Then another engine fires, and just as Tommie knew it would, the number 31 Halloween machine started to limp down that agonizingly long pit road. Tommie observed the track surface then. It was aged badly, overgrowth peeping out through busted cracks. She noticed for the first time that the outside wall in the corners that were installed just before the inaugural Groovy Hollow 300 is again missing. Only sloped sand dunes there to slow out-of-control cars. Groovy Hollow Raceway is, once again, a relic of the past. A time capsule that might have been better left unopened. But none of that seems to faze Slater or Blackwell. Bucky Blackwell powers up his Halloween machine to speed, and the two drivers duel. Slater led most of the action with Blackwell nipping at his proverbial heels. There are a couple of times where the action leaned towards taking a violent turn. Blackwell lightly touches the rear bumper of Slater's, or Tommie's, car, knocking him out of the groove a couple of times. But Slater always battled back hard on the outside, just enough to stay ahead of his nemesis. It goes on like that for maybe 20 or 30 laps. The pace of the race begins to slow as the tires fall off. Rubber builds on the racing surface like little black beads, breaking their perfect traction. That's when it happens. The front bumper of the Halloween machine makes contact with Slater's car, sending him up the track. But Slater doesn't go down without a fight. He drives back down the track and the two slam doors. Blackwell and his Halloween machine get squirrely and he chases it up the track. Further contact is made and it keeps going until both cars are sent tumbling down the sand dune towards the surrounding forest. Tommie doesn't remember leaving the grandstands. Rather, she just appears atop the dune. The sound of stadium lights switches off smack through the night behind him. She turns. The track is gone. Behind her is nothing but blank, black emptiness. She's alone. She turns back to stare down the dune. Her number 28 car has come to a rest a little farther than she remembers. The Halloween machine is nowhere in sight. Tommie starts to run towards her car. Its mangled, bent sheet metal is crushed up like an imploded aluminum can. Its steaming, mangled corpse of hot metal and brush comes to rest at the trunk of a thick tree. Though Tommie is running, it takes her a long time to get to the car. Her feet are sinking ever deeper into the sand with every exaggerated step. Finally, though, she reaches it. She grabs the window by the driver's side door and peeps in. The car's empty. Tommie takes a stumble backward. She wonders what the dream means, but can't think of it, not now. As the night tightens threateningly around her, it snuffs her out. Her dream self winks into non-existence, just as Groovy Hollow Raceway had all those years ago, the remains of which nothing but a tainted, hushed legend for time to forget. Chapter 26. On December 25th, 2023, Carol Oates spent her last Christmas at the Ivy Hall's retirement home. Carol was there, walking with a little less favorability to her right side, a decent sign of recuperation. She had a gift for Carol and had wrapped it herself in a paper she printed from the internet. The race cars printed on the paper weren't exactly NASCAR stock cars, nor were they late model stocks. They looked more like the new age cars nudging Lightning McQueen towards retirement in the movie Cars 3. But they were close enough. They were racing adjacent, which was fair game. The gift came in a box only slightly smaller than a shoebox. Tommie handed it to Carol, who smiled, knowing that she'd soon be out of there. The old woman wasted little time unwrapping the gift, tearing the pages and tossing them aside with noted eagerness. She was excited, looking more youthful by the minute, like a child awaiting a gift she had waited all holiday season on. Tommie glanced back at Mom and Dad, who supported her from behind. She was surprised, mildly, that they agreed to come with her. But they did, and not once did they talk about how Carol was a bad influence, or how they wished she'd give up her dreams of racing. Today wasn't about them, and they knew it. That was what made them such good parents in the first place. The body was modern, because that was all the custom die-cast artists Tommie had met online had at her disposal. But the design was fully retro. It was a throwback in the purest form to Carol's father in his hot pink number 22 Pontiac. Carol held the car in her hands for a moment. Then she gently sat it off to the side. She raised her arms to her face, unable to contain her emotions. When Tommie heard the woman cry, she felt awful instantly. But all of that went away when she felt the strong squeeze of Dad's hands on her shoulders behind her. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, "That's likely the best gift she's ever gotten. You did good, kid." And he kissed her cheek. That made her feel a little better. When Carol collected herself, she thanked her with a warm, generous hug. She said, "And when, not if, you get back on track, I want to be there front row or down in the pits, whichever you prefer." Carol also gave her a good, gentle peck on the cheek before they had said their goodbyes. Carol was discharged from the Ivy Hospital in January. Tommie was there to help her out and even take care of Carol in her home, which she had gone without seeing for far too long. Carol offered her a job as her personal nurse, noting that she had connections with an at-home care agency that would be more than willing to hire her on. "You just say the word, and we're not talking full-time, sweetie. I know that you've got your racing to work on. I'm just talking a couple of days a week, part-time." But Tommie declined the offer, much to Mama's disappointment. "I can't, Carol. I'm sorry," Tommie said, and Carol replied that she understood, though Tommie didn't know whether she actually did. But she reiterated that she still wanted a warm seat to sit in when Tommie finally did return to the track, which Tommie graciously guaranteed. "You got it, Toots," Tommie said with a wink, leaving her elderly friend behind. By the time her birthday rolled around in mid-February, Dad started to amp up a big surprise. He brought it up intermittently throughout the month leading up to her big day, touting it as the biggest and best surprise since her 16th birthday when she was given Amelia. That sent the hype meter into the stratosphere. How could he possibly top or even match Amelia? "Here," he said, wrapping her head and eyes in a blindfold. Mom was standing behind her recording. Tommie went along with it, though she was a little apprehensive. She never cared much for in the way of surprises. She recalled the sense of dread she felt right before Dad uncovered Amelia 4 years ago, and her throat tightened, and her mouth went dry in response. But she did her best to conceal that uncomfortable fear inside her. Dad led her through the front door, and she could smell the crisp February air. It was relatively early in the morning, and Tommie was still in her PJs. The frosted grass under her slipper crunched with each step. He turned her to the right towards the garage. Tommie was hit with a sense of déjà vu and technicolor vertigo as she recalled her past. Her skin broke out into gooseflesh, though Tommie couldn't tell if this was a reaction to the chilly morning air or her nerves getting the best of her. "No peeking," Dad said as Tommie adjusted her blindfold. "I'm not, it was just sitting weird," she said, which was partially true. She could feel her own eyelashes rubbing against her right eye, causing it to burn and water. She lowered the hand, tampering with the blindfold, and clasped her 2 hands together in front of her, waiting. The sound of her dad raising the garage door, the way it rattled all the way up to the track, filled her with nervous anticipation. Tommie readied herself to take off the blindfold, but felt her mama from behind as she pressed a hand against her back and whispered, "Not yet, sweetie. Almost." Tommie uttered a groan of discomfort and let her mom lean her forward. In her mind, she could almost see clearly where she was going and what was there. She could see the rear bumper of Amelia in front of her as she was led around and into the garage on the driver's side. "Okay, you can take your blindfold off now," Dad said, and Tommie wasted little time doing so. She let the piece of cloth fall to the chilling concrete garage floor. Sitting restfully in front of her was Amelia with a slightly revamped paint scheme. Her favorite paint scheme of all time was the Gray Ghost scheme, which was run originally by Buddy Baker back in NASCAR's founding era. Tommie knew it, though, from the 2 lines Dale Earnhardt Jr. drove the scheme, the first being the 2008 All-Star race at Charlotte. He ended up driving the car again years later in 2016 as his annual Darlington throwback. Tommie always favored the second edition of the car rather than the Citizen Soldier 3 Doors Down collaboration from '08. She had nothing against 3 Doors Down. She liked that song Kryptonite for what it was. But the nationwide N being orange, as well as the orange outline of the numbers, seemed to pop better in her mind. Now she was staring at her own rendition of the Gray Ghost scheme. There was no sponsor to speak of on the hood, so rather than leaving it blank, Dad hired a graphic designer to write "The Gray Ghost" in big Gothic letters that looked straight out of a 1960s horror film. She thought of The Haunting, remembering the font used in its trailer, and smiled. It almost mirrored it. The number 28 on the door was stylized just like Baker's classic ride, the numbers being chrome and metallic with an orange border to recall Junior's rendition of the infamous scheme. Tommie let out a wail so high-pitched that Mom and Dad had to cover their ears. She hugged them, knowing how her dad and Mom differed on the prospect of their little girl becoming a professional race car driver and setting it aside for the better good. "I take it you like it?" Dad said, laughing. "Like it? I love it. It's..." "The best birthday present you ever got?" Dad asked with a cocked eyebrow. Tommie shook her head. "No, it's the most perfect gift I've ever gotten from anyone. The best was the car itself. This, though..." Tommie started but didn't complete the thought. Dad nodded, seemingly understanding her meaning. She quickly reached into the sagging pocket of her pajama pants and pulled out her phone. She took a picture of her own and sent it to Carol, who she thought was at home and resting easily. The caption of the text just under the photograph read, "The perfect birthday." Carol replied a little over an hour later after the excitement had died down with a smiley face party emoji. Dad walked over to the car and held up his hands to visualize a movie screen. "Groovy Hollow 4, the Halloween Machine versus the Gray Ghost," he said. "Kind of has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Tommie agreed that it did and gave him another squeeze around the neck because words would never be enough to express how grateful she was. She looked at her mom then. Mama had stopped filming and she held her phone loosely in her hand. She looked at Tommie with a long, saddened face, but beneath it she was smiling. Tommie went over and gave her mom an even bigger squeeze than she had her dad. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered in her mother's ear. "Oh, you're welcome, sweetie, but this was all your dad. He hired the right people and they pieced this little dream of yours together. I only cheered from the sideline." "I don't mean for this," Tommie assured her. "I know it scares you, the thought of me getting back behind the wheel. I know it scares you awful bad, but it's something I have to do, Mama. I just have to." Mama pulled her away. A single tear fell from her right eye, smearing her makeup. She wiped it away. "I know, sweetie. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. I want you to be happy, Tommie, and more importantly..." She paused a moment and looked over at Dad. She winked. "I want you to win."
That concludes this episode of The Legend of Groovy Hollow, but there's still more to come. Tune in to the next episode for the exciting conclusion to The Legend of Groovy Hollow. Will there be a fourth race at the mysterious track? Is there even anyone left to compete with Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine? Don't miss this one. The Legend of Groovy Hollow is a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. Groovy Hollow is a production of Out of the Groove, The Daily Downforce, and AE Engine. For more great content like this, visit dailydownforce.com.